All right, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is April Johnson. I am the Director of Community Engagement and Giving here at Housing for New Hope. Housing for New Hope is a nonprofit organization committed to connecting our most vulnerable neighbors to housing and hope. Our mission is to end homelessness in Durham one valuable person at a time. There are multiple programs that help us to accomplish this. We have our street outreach program that meets our vulnerable neighbors where they are at encampments or on street corners, building relationships with them and helping them in providing resources for shelter. The Rapid Rehousing Program provides short-term assistance to finding a home and financial resources as far as paying rent and utilities to get into a home. And our supportive housing programs works to connect those who are experiencing chronic homelessness with housing, case management, and support services along their path to housing stability. We also have our affordable housing arm that provides housing for individuals and families who are at 50% AMI with clean, safe, and affordable place to rent. Our Coffee and Conversation virtual talk event invites individuals to have deeper conversations about housing and housing policy. We meet with policymakers, leaders, and researchers to help us determine what are some solutions to helping us solve our housing crisis, not just in Durham, but nationally. And I will go ahead and introduce our speakers for today's conversation. We have Representative David Price. He represents North Carolina 4th District, a rapidly growing research and education focused district that includes Durham. Before he began serving in Congress in 1987, he was a professor of political science and public policy at Duke University. He is the author of 4 books on Congress and the American political system. In North Carolina, David's constituents know him as a strong supporter of education, accessible health care, affordable housing, clean air and water, and improved transportation services alternatives. Russell Pierce, the Executive Director of Housing for New Hope, loves a good challenge, especially if it means building relationships across boundaries and borders to achieve a shared vision for change. A North Carolina native who has lived and served in 7 states in the United Kingdom, Russ became Executive Director of Housing for New Hope in 2019. He was previously an executive with Church World Service, the Ecumenical Relief, Development, and Refugee Services Agency, including serving as national head of the Crop Hunger Walk, which partners with more than 1,000 communities across the country. He also served as an executive with the United Methodist Church's 200-year-old Mission Relief and Development Agency, leading a team that annually raised more than $40 million for 600 community-based projects in more than 100 countries. Russ has relished in the opportunity to serve in one community and focus his energy on the affordable housing crisis and its impact on our most vulnerable neighbors, those experiencing homelessness. Thank you, Russ and Representative Price. And Russ, I will ask you to get started. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, April. And thanks for all you've done to bring the community together for the conversation today. And Congressman Price, it's really a delight to have you with us. As I was sharing before we started, I have this memory of meeting you when I was finishing high school in 1993, either a Boys State or Key Club State Convention or one of those pieces when I was thinking about whether I would go into something government related or the path that I ended up on. So it's really an honor to be able to be with you in these last weeks of your serving. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Good. Well, we want to start today. We are in an affordable housing crisis that is national. We hear that on the news quite regularly, and would love to hear from you as we get started. Where are we in terms of affordable housing nationally, and how have you seen that change over your years in Congress?
Well, the crisis isn't too strong a word, and the crisis is continuing. In fact, in many ways, it's exacerbated now by the increases in rental prices and also in housing costs that we're seeing and that are pricing affordable housing out of reach for many people. This is the aftermath of the pandemic and the product of our inflationary pressures right now, and many other things which I'm sure we'll get to. But affordable housing, I would say, has come a long way in terms of being a focal point for political discussion, and especially at the municipal level. The major city elections in the Triangle, certainly in recent years, almost always affordable housing has been at the top of the list, and not just as what the candidates are saying, but also in Durham, for example, a very significant housing bond a couple of years ago, which has made lots of things possible. Almost everything we're doing in Durham, that bond funding is partly a catalyst for that. So it's important. People are acting. They're certainly discussing this on the campaign trail. My mantra all along has been that affordable housing needs to be a front burner issue, right up there with public education and health. It's equally essential to people's well-being, and it's something that our country has a lot of work to do to make a reality for millions and millions of people. So we have, with the appropriations bill, which I preside over in the House, I'm the chairman of the Transportation and Housing Appropriations Subcommittee. But we have made some headway, and I hope in the course of this hour we can discuss some of the emphases that bill has brought to bear on our housing crisis, and how New Hope and other organizations, including the City of Durham, the Housing Authority, how we can take advantage of some of these things. But the estimate we make now is that out of only 1 out of 4 people who are housing deprived, who in some way should be eligible for housing support, only 1 out of 4 is receiving that support. And so there are deficiencies at every step along the way. We have a huge backlog of maintenance and upkeep and rehab for public housing. We have waiting lists of thousands in every major American city for vouchers for rental housing. We have a shortage of housing supply, which helps explain the costs that we're experiencing. The incentives for constructing affordable housing are deficient and need to be stressed. It's not just demand, it's also supply. The two need to be in some sort of balance to keep costs under control. And then home ownership is out of reach increasingly for lots of people. So, housing is not a simple need or a one-size-fits-all proposition. All the way from conventional public housing to home ownership, there's a spectrum of needs. Government programs are designed to address each of those, and we're attempting to get that funding where it needs to be. But the kind of role that Housing for New Hope plays is absolutely critical, emphasizing homelessness and what it takes realistically to get people from homelessness to being able to live independently. It's not just a roof over their head, it's supportive services and all the rest that your organization is known for. I do go back a ways with this organization. Speaking of the memories we have, I was a good friend and colleague of Jack Price, who he was a sociologist at Duke, but he also was a very, very public spirited citizen who took on housing as a cause and had a major impact on Durham's housing situation. And his organization merged with Housing for New Hope some years ago. I remember when that happened. And then of course I remember your founder, Terry Olibaugh, who did such wonderful work over the years and still does. Yeah. But Russ, glad to get an account here of your leadership and of the more recent activities, and I appreciate the chance to join with you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's interesting to think about the national issues and what we're facing here. I feel like every time we open the newspaper here, we're finding we're in the top 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of something that we don't want to be in the top 5 of. And one of them right now is the rental increases we're experiencing. You've likely seen a lot of this, but I heard just this morning that just in the last 6 months, median rent for 1 bedrooms has gone up $135 a month. just in the last 6 months. And we're seeing 2-bedroom units over 2,000, 1-bedroom units consistently over 1,500. And what that means is that nearly half of the people in Durham who are renters, their housing is not necessarily affordable or necessarily secure. And what we're hearing more and more from, a lot of our local colleagues and partners is we've gone from talking about displacement and gentrification to this fear of mass displacement coming, that we are going to lose so much housing so quickly here. And a lot of that is, of course, affecting the number of folks that are experiencing homelessness. And that's, since we kind of work in different sectors as an agency, we see this in so many different ways with landlords selling properties that are then taken off the market for rentals. We're seeing these increases. It's interesting, when I came in 2019, one of the questions I had was, do we have families that are, sleeping in the car overnight? How many families do we have that are unsheltered in that way? And the answer was, well, that's not something we really run into here. Folks can usually get access pretty quickly, or families support them. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had 25 families in Durham that were unable to access shelter at all, which is a huge increase over the last few years. So, for us, a big issue is just access to rental housing here, even beyond what DHA is working on. I'm curious, what do you see as opportunities for us to address this? What are some systems changes that are helping us look at increasing the amount of affordable housing in communities?
Well, as you've indicated just by that quick overview, it's a complex problem with many pieces. Let me just comment on a couple of aspects of this and the way federal housing policy, including funding availability, is affected by all this. First of all, the rental increases do threaten to make housing unaffordable, rental housing unaffordable for many people who are renting at this moment or who need to rent. And so it creates pressures that at the most extreme will create homelessness. Certainly will create a lot of people paying 50, 60% of their income in rent, which is really not sustainable for families at modest income levels. So the need for subsidies, for support for these people, and is increased, and those waiting lists for vouchers for the usual Section 8 vouchers, but also for the veterans vouchers, other vouchers that are available to people with special situations. That demand goes up, those waiting lists go up, and then it becomes more costly to to keep the vouchers going that we already have. The problem I face with the HUD budget each year is that before I spend a dime, I have to put in billions of dollars to account for the increased cost of vouchers just to hold people harmless. And by the way, that is sometimes a stretch. I mean, we do adjust. We do, of course, each year the amount available to cover vouchers is increased. Like I say, before we appropriate another dime. But there's a lot of competition for this housing, especially in our area. Students, for example. This is quite acute in Chapel Hill, but it's also present in Durham, where the landlords are tempted to turn to students or to others who will pay the rent and for whom it's maybe less hassle, or they see it that way. And so they drop out of the Section 8 program, and we have to struggle to keep people in the program. Mm-hmm. We do pay them fair rent, but sometimes they can do better, they think, on the open market with others who are competing for this housing. So this affects the availability of housing, yes, to millions of people, but it also affects the demand for the support we provide and the cost of even keeping that level, holding people harmless. And of course, we want to do more than holding people harmless. We have new vouchers in this new bill that I hope we can pass in December. We need more vouchers, not fewer, but the crunch that you're talking about makes it a challenge to maintain even what we've got.
Well, that's such a helpful perspective, because I know one of the things we often talk about here is the fact that with our our rapid rehousing programs, both the HUD COC funded side and the ESG funded side, there's some restrictions around fair market rent, um, and a couple that HUD sets every year. And it was interesting because I think this was right about the time of the pandemic starting. Was one of those years where all of a sudden our rent rate started going up here. So it was like 34% for 2-bedroom units. It was about 28% for 26%, excuse me, for 1-bedroom units that year. And in that same year, we had a fairly large increase from HUD on the FMR, but it was like 4%.
Right.
And so I think sometimes what we miss is thinking about that the broader issue across the nation that's happening.
Right.
We
Well, we
see
also
it
need
as,
to,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Well, we also need to be reminded, as I said at the beginning, of Economics 101, and that is that this is not about just demand, it's also about supply. And
Right.
there are complex reasons for people not building more affordable housing. But we need to look at that supply side as well. There is some good news on that front in Durham. We just had you might say, a reopening of the J.J. Henderson Tower there
Yes.
in downtown, and around that area there's construction going on for several hundred more units of rental housing. And that brings me to mention something we haven't talked about, but it's not just appropriations, it's not just the vouchers that help close this gap. It's also the tax credits and the kind of tax credits that are administered by our state housing finance agency that some are quite generous at 9%, others less so at 4%, but they're all important. And that happens to have been what closed the gap with the J.J. Henderson project. And so we have more rental housing coming on the market by virtue of that, by rehabbing the old tower and then adding these new rental units. And that relieves the pressure on the supply of housing, and that, of course, keeps the cost down. So that's really quite important to keep new construction going. I'll mention just quickly, you can come back to it if we want, but we have included more money in the bill for a couple of other sources of housing supply. One is the so-called Section 202 housing for the elderly, giving incentives, especially for NGOs, nonprofits, to sometimes congregations will construct rental housing for the elderly. We have a lot of those scattered around the triangle from past years, and we've been able to bring that program back. Similarly, the housing for the people with disabilities. There are some rental vouchers for those folks. You may have accommodated some of those folks in your housing. But there's also group homes that we can construct and relieve some of the pressures there. Housing for people with AIDS, also a program that provides some rental assistance and relieves some of the pressures. So there are a number of pieces here that need to come together.
Well, it's helpful because I think one of the things we experience in a sense is because there's even as we serve folks who have experienced homelessness, there's always complex issues that they've been experiencing, and we are seeing more and more folks who are older that are within the homeless population. We are seeing more folks who could utilize HOPWA type support, and I think the more we can, as you're saying, like the more we can get some of these pieces back out and running and expanded, we have more ability to put people into those kind of housing opportunities, which is really good. And it's very interesting. One of the things here I think that's great in Durham is that the agencies tend to work very cooperatively with each other and very collaboratively. I've been other places where that was not always the situation. It was more competition than collaboration. And I think one of the pieces that we've learned, because again, because we do homeless service work and affordable housing, we're unusual in doing both. And definitely we're involved in so many aspects of homeless services that oftentimes, if there are agencies that are smaller that need help and resources, we're able to come alongside and help them in training and growing. But on the affordable
Let me
housing,
just underscore the importance of what you're saying, because I know it's true. And I also know it is a hallmark of the way Housing for New Hope has always operated. You occupy a particular niche that's your specialty. I dare to say the transition of people from homelessness into the capacity for independent living. You're very good at that. You have a track record there, but you're going to run across people with all kinds of needs, which you may or may not be able to directly accommodate. So it is really important to have those collaborative relationships across the city, so that you can refer people and you can get people the help that they need. And the same is true of CASA and Passage Home and these and the DHIC, these Wayne County organizations that they all don't all do the same thing, but they do complementary things, and they support each other.
Well, and I think one of the great gifts, there's actually a group that the Duke Office of Durham and Community Affairs pulls a number of us together as the affordable housing nonprofit developers. And I always kind of smile, because in that situation, there's a lot for us to learn. We need a lot of partnering to help us in that work. But it's been so interesting because, like, we've purchased land on the east side of Durham. We're working through what that project could look like, leaning strongly towards supportive housing, but we'll kind of see what options are. And it's so interesting because I think one of the things we've learned is there are a lot of agencies, I see them across the state, that are willing to step into this work, but it is so complex, and the amount of time it takes to get projects up and running, the expertise you need, especially when you start running into the understandable regulations on HUD grants and different pieces.
It is complicated. We observed that down at the J.J. Henderson rededication a few days ago about how many moving parts this project had. But you guys are good at it, and a lot of people have mastered this. I remember years ago when I was shepherding a number of these elderly housing grants through, and these congregations would take this on. And there was support available. The congregation typically would form a 501c3, a tax exempt organization, or else they would contract with one, and then a lot of the technical details would be mastered by other people. There is help available, and in fact, in this, another thing we have in this bill is for groups that don't have that kind of technical capacity, who don't have the kind of partnerships that might be available in Durham. We have some technical assistance funding that they can draw on to develop that. But we don't want to add to the inequity, by having a process that's so complex that you have to have a PhD to figure it out. We need to pay attention to people's access to the grant process and how they can compete effectively. And we like you say, we've done very well in Durham, but nationally, this capacity to even play the game is lacking with some organizations, and we need to tend to that.
And that'll will make, I think the technical capacity piece will make such a difference for a lot of agencies, and especially to your point. I mean, as a number of us have been working on the issue here in Durham, I mean, there's I heard somebody say, to build affordable housing effectively, you need the leadership to do it, and that's in agencies, city, county, state, federal support. You need the resources to do the building, and you need the land. And in Durham, our issue is land. And so we've talked a lot about the fact, there's some city land available, some county land available, and we've seen some really creative solutions around that, even on Main Street, around some of those building projects. The other piece that we've identified is there are many faith communities here that have excess land, and how do we partner and encourage them to step up? Because I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but you referenced there was a period there where there were a lot of churches step forward for senior communities to be built on their properties.
Well, the very, very nice affordable rental housing for seniors on the property of St. Joseph's Church on Fayetteville Street is a
great example.
Is a good example of that. There's Manley Estates and Covenant Place, I think it's called, in Chapel Hill. There's a number of these in Raleigh. Yes, that's one program that I was determined to bring that back when I became chairman, and We've done it 1 year at a time. So there is a pot of money there now. There is a national competition once again for that kind of housing for the elderly. And that's when a church or a nonprofit wants to ask what they can do, how they can get directly involved. That is one way, and that's one of the more obvious examples of how there's a pot of money there for those who go after it and provide credible applications. And then there are also the bigger projects that normally a nonprofit wouldn't undertake, like the other announcement we had in Durham recently, the $40 million Choice Neighborhoods program. Speaking of downtown and speaking of really making a dent in this problem, I'm very proud of that. I'm proud to have brought that program back. You used to call it Hope 6. It's the only HUD program that develops a whole neighborhood comprehensively, and it would take on dilapidated public housing, would either demolish and replace that, or would rehab it and then fill in the community so that it's has some commercial space and has parks and amenities and maybe a school. I mean, that's a unique program. Winston-Salem got one of those grants, and now Durham has. And the Durham one is going to be bounded by East Main and Liberty Street right downtown. It's a great thing. Now, that's not something an organization of your size is going to undertake on its own. But in this case, the Housing Authority applied for that funding, and there will be lots of pieces of it that other organizations can take charge of.
Well, interestingly, as a footnote, it is right across from our Andover apartments, and the first part of which Jack Price's group built years ago. So we've been watching really closely and thinking through, those have been there 20 years or almost now, thinking through, okay, with this change coming, what does that mean for the work that we're doing there in our supportive housing? So we're very, very excited to see that. Yeah. One of the pieces that comes up, it's interesting, we work really closely with the Sanford School of Public Policy and several other schools at Duke and other local universities. And particularly for the students that are keen on issues around housing, about 10 minutes into learning the situation in Durham, they'll always say, the thing that nobody's done here yet is inclusionary zoning. Why don't you have inclusionary zoning? And of course, we have to explain that in North Carolina, we're not allowed to have, by the work of the state legislature, we're not allowed to do that. And I'm just curious. I mean, I know you're certainly working at a different level, but I'm curious, what examples have you seen of people thinking creatively around that? Because that does seem to be very effective in other places, but it's just not something that we're able to do in Durham.
Well, it is it's one of those local issues that often is pretty controversial, politically difficult, but the zoning questions, the land use questions, including these density issues, which even in politically progressive communities, sometimes these things are difficult. I think of the long struggle in Chapel Hill to have this habitat sponsored community built in a very, very nice housing with a range of income levels available, and it took just years to get that done. It now is underway, thankfully. But yeah, this often requires a lot of lifting locally and politically. There's been some federal experimentation with incentivizing this, with making the local action to adopt inclusionary zoning or to do other positive things locally, to make that a plus factor in getting grants. And of course, in awarding the grants, the feds often consider, where this is located and whether it addresses these questions of equity and overcoming past inequities. That's certainly an issue in the part of Durham we're talking about. The Durham Freeway cut right through the Hayti neighborhood, and to this day has a detrimental effect on the kind of integrity of that part of town. And so that is, I would imagine, was a factor. And I know it was a factor in Durham's application. And it's probably a factor in getting the award that Hope 6 or Choice Neighborhoods grant is in that part of town that was adversely affected in the past. So it isn't as simple as the feds taking over zoning. I don't, even though that might have some, there are occasions where you wish that could happen. I don't think that's what we want. I mean, these decisions need to have local buy-in and local participation, and hopefully cooler heads and more conscientious voices will prevail here in understanding that at all levels of government, there's going to need to be a willingness to take this seriously and to alter past practices. And in the case of zoning, that's certainly a case in point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like we're, particularly in Durham, there's been some very good efforts around finding more ways for people to find creative housing solutions. And one of the pieces we participated in was, 3 years ago, we opened up Holloway Place that used to be, you may have visited Dove House at some point in the past. I did. And so as transitional shelters, funding for that went away, and we took up more and more the work of rapid rehousing and saw the value of that housing first philosophy. We ended up taking a Dove House, closing out that program, and partnering with the city and others to transform it into the area's first, I think the regions beyond North Carolina, first attempt at affordable co-housing. And it's been such an interesting learning experience to bring that kind of product to the market, where people have their own, lease on a room, but then shared, just absolutely gorgeous shared spaces. The goal was for it to be affordable housing that doesn't look affordable, is a good way to describe it. And we're seeing, more work on folks thinking about small, small tiny home collectives potentially in the community. We're seeing more conversation around ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units, and that's become much more permissible in Durham. I think one of the things that's been interesting, we're hearing more conversation, not necessarily in Durham but from other places, is around manufactured housing. And certainly, North Carolina is in the top 4 or 5 states in terms of the amount of manufactured housing that's part of the housing stock. And I'm just curious, your thoughts as we look creatively. I honestly don't hear much talk about manufactured housing. As we look at that as a possible solution to increase, what are some of the regulations that should or could be put in place that would help us keep those affordable? Because one of the interesting things that's happening is many places where it has been available, has been affordable. The land is owned by folks who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s and selling it. And then the affordability goes away, or the whole community goes away.
I'm glad you brought it up, because it is a major portion of our housing stock is manufactured housing, and nowhere more than in North Carolina. It is a major factor. And you say you haven't heard much about it. I think you're going to hear more about it, because we made that a centerpiece of our housing bill this year. I regard that, I guess, as kind of a parting gesture to call attention to this kind of housing and its potential role in addressing a lot of the issues. I mean, for one thing, a lot of the construction that we do and the home ownership that we encourage can involve manufactured housing and lower construction costs. That's one aspect, and certainly the trailer park of yore, the kind of stereotype people have about mobile homes and manufactured housing is due for a major overhaul. And some of these homes, I mean, you look at them and you could not tell them from a conventionally built home. So it's a way to construct housing that promises to cut costs and increase our ability to increase the supply. However, you're talking about the existing communities, and that's really what we're talking about in this bill as well. These are I visited. We've had some challenges in this area with some conditions in these communities that needed to be addressed, and also some displacement issues where where the properties were bought by developers, sometimes people in distant places. The rents went up, and then sometimes there's been a threat just to convert the property. It's valuable property, and just get rid of the mobile homes and put the property to some other use. So all of those things are challenges to what are often quite established communities. I've visited a couple of them over the last couple of years as these problems came up, and these are modest homes, but people live there for 20 years, 25 years. They're established communities. They are valued homes and valued communities by people who live there, and so we devised a quite flexible program to let interested parties preserve these communities, in some cases improve them, rehab them, and also in some cases for the tenants to assume ownership themselves. I mean, there's a range of solutions that you can see across the country, and we need to have flexible funding available to address that. Sometimes the city or the housing authority might take this on, or a nonprofit or a tenants association. I mean, there's all kinds of levels at which this would take place. Here too, there's a local element. I mean, the local jurisdictions need to enforce safe, decent housing standards. Okay, so to the extent there are septic tanks overflowing or other problems that we saw, the local authorities, and I had local officials touring these places with me. Those local authorities need to take hold of this, and I think once the problems are manifest, that they'll feel a lot of obligation to do that. But in terms of the kind of federal support that might be available to provide improved infrastructure for these communities, to have some rehab going on, or to just essentially buy out the developers who would convert them to other uses, but to present an alternative to local organizations to just letting the market determine this. I think this program will be helpful. There are already some funds that can be creatively used in this way. The home funds, for example, are flexible enough to apply to manufactured housing communities in some cases, and the CDBG, Community Development Block Grants, you could use them right now to improve sidewalks and sewer systems and so on. But we need a dedicated source of funds, and I think a new emphasis on mobile homes at the federal level, and I hope this bill will provide it.
So as you that's really helpful, and I think it's going to have to be part of our creative solutions. The more I hear from our local community and other places, we've just I think the head of community development here said one day, we've got to get away from the idea of thinking every solution has to be a Cape Cod house with a picket fence.
Right.
We have to find more creative solutions, and we've been delighted, especially with Holloway Place, to be part of that, but also watching out, especially as we're able to acquire land, to think through creatively what else might be possible. So I'm curious. I think in a minute, April might have some questions for us from folks that are with us. But as you're preparing to step back and transition to a new phase of life and engagement, what are some of the other issues you see on the horizon about affordable housing, or pieces we haven't touched on yet in our conversation?
Well, we've touched on a lot of things, and I have tried to, as the ranking Democratic member under Republican leadership, and then as the chairman under Democratic leadership, I've tried to have a rising tide that lifts all these programs. As I said earlier, I don't think there's a silver bullet with respect to affordable housing. I think that whole spectrum needs attention. Certainly, speaking of Durham and what needs attention, the experience we had at McDougal Terrace with the carbon monoxide leaks, and we had to spend a lot of money to just make those places safe live at that public housing. And so that's the tip of the iceberg, I think, in terms of public housing rehab needs across the country. Sometimes we can convert that into rental housing the way we did at J.J. Henderson, and that sometimes makes the dollars go further and helps us serve more people. But from there all the way up to promoting homeownership, the spectrum of housing programs deserves support, and I've tried to provide that year to year. Unfortunately, we did not get the president's Build Back Better initiative enacted. The good portion of the infrastructure proposal from President Biden was enacted, bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is pretty broadly conceived. I mean, it's not just roads and bridges, it's also broadband, big need in urban and rural parts of North Carolina. It also addresses water and sewer systems, and so there's a pretty broad definition of infrastructure, but not including housing, and that was a big disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
Housing is infrastructure, and housing needed to be included in that bill, and so some of the ideas for the manufactured housing provisions of this year's appropriations bill, we did take from Build Back Better. But Build Back Better with the major infusion of housing investment is still on the agenda. And so we haven't done everything we set out to do. However, year by year, we've made some headway, and I guess my signature programs would be bringing back to life the programs we've talked about here. And they had fallen into a kind of holding pattern, and Trump, in many cases, tried to eliminate them entirely. Trump tried to zero out choice neighborhoods, and so that was a near-death experience that we countered that, and we countered it on a bipartisan basis. But we need to do more than just hold things harmless. We need to be building and again increasing the supply of housing. And I've concentrated on 202 housing for the elderly, on 811 housing for people with disabilities, and on HUPWA, housing for people with AIDS, and on the Choice Neighborhoods, formerly Hope 6 program, to do comprehensive redevelopment. And I'm proud of what we've been able to do there. And I'm also proud that North Carolina communities, most certainly including Durham, have been able to claim some of those funds. You know, you gotta increase the supply of funding at the federal level, but you also got to have the local players who are ready to put forward strong applications and claim some of those funds.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn to April. I'm suspecting there's some questions.
Yes, thank you, Russ. We do have a few questions. Okay, so we have a question from Robert. He says that H&H partners with other nonprofits and also with private landlords with private landlords in the local housing market, but development is another story. Private developers typically look at a 30-year time frame for return on investment and then design and budget accordingly. H&H and other nonprofits often need to look at a much longer time frame, which means that the budget and design decisions may be different and can be geared for residents with a range of special support requirements. Are there new opportunities to work toward market-based incentives that provide a win-win for private developers and nonprofit partnerships?
Well, it's a good question, and I think the answer partly is stated in the premise. You know, no, the incentives are not strong enough, and the kind of construction that's going on across the entire housing market is tilted in a damaging way toward upper end construction, and we don't have enough developers in the affordable housing market area. How do you change that? Well, probably the most effective device we have is the tax credits, and so our state housing finance agency, our local agencies work with developers to point out those opportunities and to put together the plans that let them utilize those tax credits. And so that's how private developers are often brought into the picture. And then initiatives like Housing for New Hope, like other housing organizations, often create partnerships of their own, incentives of their own. Local leadership is important. I think you can't just assume that market forces are going to solve this. I mean, we should know that. We should know that now. And so the market needs to be modified, and that can be a policy incentive like the tax credit, or it can be a local leadership that puts these deals together and brings the private developers into it and lets them make a decent profit, but also lets them serve the community's need.
I think I would add to that. I mean, I think that's a terrific and comprehensive answer. I think we are seeing more attempts at how to bring public and private or nonprofit and more market rate developments together to see creative solutions where we maybe weren't before. And again, lacking the ability to incentivize as directly as we might like in other circumstances, as broad as that can be, just trying to think through it really creatively. And I think where we can find, there are private developers who are, in some cases, B corporations, if folks know that reference, and they have that third bottom line. They are trying to find these solutions. So where we can streamline and support them in that work, it makes a big difference, because I know there's a number of developers in town trying to figure out how to demonstrate that there are some potential market solutions for affordable housing that wouldn't involve any government funding. And there's creating space for that to be tried out is important too.
Thank you both. We have another question from a concerned citizen. There's been a lot of discussion on long-term policies that can help bring housing costs down. In your opinion, will we see some relief on the immediate horizon? Will rent prices go down, or will we see more housing supply come up soon?
Well, you probably need a better economic forecaster than I am to answer that in a really satisfying way. We're in a rough patch now, and I don't think it's going to end easily or quickly. On the other hand, there are forces at work that can offer relief, and I don't know. Maybe Russ knows what some of the forecasts look like, but the deliberate policies that are underway to increase housing supply, and the kind of natural workings of the housing market. We need to get housing construction moving again. There's some indications that it is beginning to pick up, and that it's picking up at all levels, but not nearly the extent it's going to need to. So I would say we have identified what needs to happen, and we need to have a concerted policy at all levels to help make it happen.
And I'd agree. I mean, I think our earlier conversation around the different types of housing, I mean, you can even expand that to looking at, just regular construction for market rate construction is important, because of what we've partially experienced here over the last 3 or 4 years is, households that would have come and bought a $350,000, $400,000 house in say 2019, they can't afford that house anymore. And so they're not able to find housing. And so they're ending up in the rental market, which then pushes up all of those rental rates. And so I think it sounds counterintuitive at time where we may come back and say, part of the solution is there needs to be more market rate housing out there at different levels, but it really is, because otherwise, especially, I think that's a lot of what we see in Durham is a lot of the naturally affordable occurring housing is being taken off the market. It's being sold and made into private homes, or it's being removed and put into fuller developments. And a lot of that's being driven by what's lack of other housing options at the market rates.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. We really appreciate your time here. And I want to be mindful of your time. I want to thank the audience. Thank you for joining us today and having your coffee. I meant to show you my Love Durham mug. So we want to continue to love Durham and love Durham enough that we ensure that we support organizations like Housing for New Hope, who is helping folks connect to housing as well. So check us out. Check out our website, www.housingfornewhope.org. If you're not that familiar with us, we have a lot of opportunities for to volunteer. And also we would ask that you support the organization, support the Housing Assets Fund. This fund allows us to broadly be able to assist those who need housing, whether it's for rent, utilities, whatever it may be, whatever the whatever the barrier is for getting housing, we support those who are in our program. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope that you join us for future coffee and conversation events. We do have some coming up in the future, some very interesting authors, very interesting researchers, and we hope that you will join us in the future. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Congressman, for the time this morning.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.